I came to Wilford to spend Halloween with my uncle. He was the only family I had left, and I hadn't seen him in years. It seemed like the perfect escape, an old town with a reputation for going all out for Halloween. My uncle lived in a creaky two-story house on the outskirts, the kind that looked like it belonged in a different time. He was a Halloween fanatic, and as soon as I stepped through the door, I was greeted by rows of jack-o'-lanterns, plastic bats, and spider webs strung across the porch. "It's been too long, Paul," he said, wrapping me in a hug. He looked older than I remembered, with more wrinkles and a slowness in his step, but he still had that same enthusiastic spark in his eyes. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I helped my uncle set up decorations, bake Halloween treats, and carve pumpkins. But then Halloween night arrived, and the town took on an entirely different feel. It wasn't the cheerful kind of spooky anymore. It was something that settled into my bones, making my skin crawl. We had just finished handing out candy to the last of the trick-or-treaters when my uncle suddenly said he needed to go into town to pick up something he'd forgotten. I offered to go with him, but he shook his head. No, you stay here and enjoy the decorations. I won't be long." It sounded simple enough, so I agreed. I watched him drive off down Elm Street, the taillights disappearing into the fog that had rolled in. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to catch a few more of the spooky displays the town was famous for. As I walked, the streets seemed to empty out. Lights turned off one by one in the houses, and the sound of kids' laughter faded away. I found myself on a street lined with massive oaks, their branches twisting above me like skeletal fingers. That's when I saw it. A house on the corner with no decorations, no lights, just a plain, dark facade that seemed out of place. A lone pumpkin sat on the porch, uncarved. I shrugged it off, but as I turned to leave, I noticed a figure in the window, just standing there watching me. My skin prickled. It wasn't unusual for someone to be looking out of their own window, but something about it felt wrong. I kept walking, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. Yet, when I glanced back, the figure was still there, their silhouette barely visible against the dim interior. I picked up my pace, turning down another street toward my uncle's house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It was irrational, I told myself, just paranoia. But when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw a shadowy figure a few houses behind, keeping pace with me. It had to be a trick of the light, one of the decorations swaying in the wind maybe. Still, I started walking faster. A few blocks later, I turned down Elm Street again, only to see my uncle's house come into view. Relief washed over me, but as I approached the porch, I noticed something that made my stomach knot. The front door was slightly ajar. He wouldn't have left it open like that, not even for a minute. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. "Uncle, are you back?" I called out, but there was no answer. The house felt different, the air heavy with the scent of the candles we had lit earlier. I made my way through the living room, past the flickering jack-o'-lanterns, to the back door. It was wide open, swaying in the wind. My mind raced with possible explanations. Maybe my uncle came back while I was out walking, got distracted, and forgot to close it. I shut the back door and locked it, then went upstairs, checking each room. But there was no sign of him. Just as I was about to head back down, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye through the window. Someone walking down the side of the house, a shadow crossing through the garden. I rushed downstairs and yanked open the front door, scanning the yard. Nothing. Not a soul in sight. Just the faint fog rolling across the ground and the swaying branches of the old trees. I closed the door, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But when I turned around, I found another surprise. A small, unmarked box sitting on the kitchen table. I didn't remember seeing it earlier. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the box and found a single note inside, written in my uncle's familiar handwriting. "Stay inside. Do not open the door for anyone." I tried to call him, but my phone had no signal. I checked the landline, but it was dead too. The uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger and I locked all the doors, making sure every window was secured. Hours passed, the house growing colder with each minute. I kept checking the front door, expecting to see my uncle's car pull up, but the road stayed empty. I decided to wait it out in the living room, keeping a wary eye on the street through the window. Then, just before midnight, there was a knock on the door. Soft but deliberate. I froze. My uncle's note flashed through my mind and I backed away from the door. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. I stood in the middle of the darkened room, breathing heavily, trying to decide whether to ignore it or call out. But then through the peephole I saw it. The same figure from earlier, standing just outside, wearing a long coat that seemed to swallow the shadows around him. "Paul, it's me," a voice said from the other side of the door. It sounded like my uncle, but something in the tone was off. "Let me in." My hand hovered over the lock, but the note echoed in my head. I backed away, and the knocking stopped. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, gripping the note and staring at the door until the first light of dawn finally broke through. When the sun rose, I found my uncle's car parked in the driveway, the driver's seat empty. He never came back. I searched the town, but no one had seen him. No one could explain the figure on the porch either. And when I went back to the corner house to ask about the man I'd seen in the window, I found an abandoned lot instead. Now, every Halloween, I receive a new note on my doorstep, always in the same handwriting, and always with the same warning: stay inside. I was 23 when it happened. It was Halloween night, and I was at a party hosted by my old friend Jason. Jason had been throwing these Halloween bashes every year since high school. His parents always flew out to New York for the holiday, leaving him with the house to himself. They had no idea just how wild these parties could get, and that year was no different. Jason went all out, like he always did. He transformed his place into a haunted maze with elaborate decorations, fake cobwebs, skeletons, and terrifying props that he must have spent a small fortune on. The party was typical for Jason. Plenty of drinking, questionable substances, and a lot of bad decisions. But I'll skip the details on that. Let's just say none of us were exactly thinking straight when things took a turn for the worse. It was around midnight when it started. I was upstairs with Jason, Vinny, Trey, and Marcus, passing around a bong in Jason's room. The music downstairs was blasting, so when we heard two loud bangs echoing from below, we almost brushed it off as part of the noise. But then, there was screaming. Panicked, desperate screaming. Jason leapt to the door, fumbling with the handle before swinging it open. He peeked down the hall, his face pale with terror. "Lock the door!" we all shouted at him, panic seeping into our voices. But he only managed to stumble back inside and lock it before slamming it shut. His face told us everything. Whatever was happening downstairs wasn't just a party gone wrong. He whispered frantically, telling us to hide. We didn't ask questions. The music had cut out, and the air was thick with tension. Jason and Marcus squeezed into the closet while Trey and I slid under the bed, and Vinny climbed into a storage box in the corner. We huddled in the dark, barely breathing, listening to the chaos unfold downstairs. We heard a man's voice, deep and angry, barking orders to the terrified crowd. I couldn't make out the words, but then a woman screamed, and that sound was followed by a loud crack. Silence. The next voice we heard was calmer, quieter, but no less menacing. By then we realized there were at least 3 intruders, but it was impossible to tell if there were more. Footsteps thundered up the stairs, heavy boots hitting each step with purpose. They reached the hallway and I held my breath as the doorknob rattled. The intruder tried the handle, then threw his weight against the door. The banging made my chest tighten. Finally, I heard the pop of gunshots, shots aimed at the lock. The door swung open and I could see boots stepping into the room from beneath the bed. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to keep my breathing as quiet as possible. Jason and Marcus weren't as lucky. I heard Jason's shaky voice begging the intruder not to hurt him, offering money, anything he had if they'd just leave. Jason confessed he owned the house, and the intruder ordered him downstairs. It felt like an eternity before Jason's footsteps faded, and we heard the front door slam. I stayed under that bed, terrified that another intruder would find us. But then Jason's voice called up from downstairs, shaky but alive, telling us that they were gone. I crawled out from under the bed, my body trembling with relief. I followed Jason's voice down the stairs, Trey and Marcus trailing behind me. What I saw in the living room will never leave my mind. Two of our friends, Kara and Blake, lay on the floor, blood pooling beneath them. Their lifeless bodies stared up at the ceiling, expressions frozen in terror. I'll never forget the sight. The police arrived within the hour, drawn by the calls from the neighbors who had heard the commotion. They didn't care much about the party scene or the drugs, only the masked men who had stormed in, killed 2 kids, and vanished. Jason later told us that there were actually 4 of them, all dressed in long coats and masks that hid their faces. They demanded cash, $200,000. When Jason couldn't give it to them, they forced him to gather anything valuable in a sack, while the party guests were made to toss in their wallets under the threat of a gun. Jason never recovered from that night. He blamed himself, even though none of us did. He stopped showing up to class, dropped out of school, and turned to harder substances to drown out the guilt. I spoke to him one last time before he shut everyone out. He was sitting in his room, the same place where we'd all hidden that night, with a bottle in his hand and tears running down his face. He told me he couldn't live with the memories, the weight of knowing that his party had turned into a nightmare. He died of a heroin overdose the following October, almost a year to the day after that horrible night. I sometimes wonder if deep down he knew he wouldn't make it through another Halloween. It was Halloween night, and my small town of Havenbrook had transformed into a scene from a postcard, jack-o'-lanterns flickering on every doorstep, the air heavy with the sweet smell of caramel apples and crisp autumn leaves. Children in costumes paraded down the streets, and haunted houses were in full swing. But as I walked home from my friend's party, I felt a chill that wasn't just from the October breeze. I glanced over my shoulder. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure among the shadows wearing a mask, one of those old-fashioned faceless masks that people wore decades ago. I laughed it off, thinking it was just someone pulling a prank. After all, Halloween was all about getting spooked, right? But then I heard footsteps. Soft at first, then louder, echoing mine. I quickened my pace, feeling my pulse race as I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. The town had its fair share of pranksters, teenagers who loved to scare anyone who seemed an easy target. I turned down Maple Lane, where the houses were older and the decorations a bit more elaborate. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows over the skeletons and cobwebs draped across the porches. I clutched my phone in my hand, the comforting glow of the screen the only light I could depend on. "Hey, whoever's following me, it's not funny," I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. My voice seemed to dissolve into the cold air. No response. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. My friend's house was just a few blocks away. I could double back, but something told me that wouldn't be smart. Instead, I decided to make it home, hoping to lose whoever it was. As I turned onto my street, the footsteps stopped. I glanced back, but the street was empty, eerily silent except for the distant laughter of kids and the occasional howl of the wind. Maybe I had imagined it after all. When I reached my house, I paused on the porch, fumbling with my keys. Just then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A small note tucked beneath the pumpkin I had carved that afternoon. The handwriting was jagged like a child's and read, "You can't hide from the shadows." I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me, locking it, and double-checking the windows. I dialed my friend's number, but it went straight to voicemail. The house felt too quiet, every creak of the old wood sending a shiver down my spine. I went to the living room, pulling the curtains shut, but when I glanced outside, I saw him again. The figure in the mask stood at the edge of my yard, staring up at my window. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them. He raised a hand and waved slowly, almost mockingly, before slipping back into the darkness. I turned off the lights, hoping that if he couldn't see me, he'd leave. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I kept checking my phone, my hands shaking, wishing I had called the police sooner. Finally, I heard the faint sound of footsteps on my front porch. There was a knock at the door, soft, barely more than a tap, but it reverberated through the house. I held my breath, backing away slowly, until my heel caught on something, sending me sprawling onto the floor. My phone slid out of my hand, clattering across the hardwood. I heard a voice, low and raspy, coming from the other side of the door. "You can't hide from me." I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the nearest object, a brass candlestick, and pressed my back against the wall, heart hammering in my chest. Silence. Then, the footsteps receded, growing fainter until they vanished altogether. I didn't dare move until I was sure he was gone. When I finally gathered the courage to peek out the window, there was no sign of him, just the wind blowing through the bare trees. I stayed up all night, clutching the candlestick, every creak of the house making me jump. By morning, I convinced myself that it was just some sick Halloween prank, but when I stepped outside, there was another note. "I'll see you again next Halloween.